I've been skimming through this book, and then I get distracted because I get sucked into the story. I was thinking how this book is like relationship. It's probably my oldest friend, and it's such a wonderful connection to a couple of my grandparents and childhood friend that, I later lost touch with, but still has a sentimental place in my heart anyway. Just like any relationship that's changed over the years, it's just become a little more mature, a little more thoughtful, and there's just something in it for me personally. Every time I read it, something deeper.
That's really beautiful.
It is a beautiful story. It really is. And I'm so happy that it exists because it's just, in this last year when I've been sick, it was there again. Thumbed through this again and, of course, got sucked in and read the whole thing. And I find that it's hilarious. It's so witty. I love her writing style so much. It's lively. It's just a fun, quick read, but it has everything in it, It's grief and the hardship, challenge. It's kind of like Tom Hanks, how Tom Hanks is famous for being the everyman in his movies so everyone can relate. And I feel like the marches are a lot like that. And probably one of the reasons why this story has endured, but I'm sure there's plenty of psychological reasons that I don't know about it has, but I think that that's why it works for me. And I can see why my grandparents liked it, why my grandmothers liked it. Wonderful how it makes connections. That's why I'm here with you now.
Yeah. I know what you mean, because I think in different parts of my life when I have read it, it has had some meaning during that time, and then it changes during different life situations. I think that happens with every book that I read, especially if they are familiar from my childhood.
I think that's why children's books are so important. One of my daughters, my oldest daughter, said she took a psych class at her college, and they were discussing the importance of literature and music in creating empathy, how important it is to read and to listen to music for that reason, and that's a big thing. I really feel like that's true for me. I feel like it gives you opportunities to experience what it's like to walk in another person's shoes. So that's what empathy is, having imagination enough to be able to do that.
Yes, you can relate to the other person, their life and their struggles or their good moments.
And maybe that's why I've been thinking of Laurie and Joe's relationship, of course, and the Amy problem that crops up for a lot of people. I think as a younger person, without having a fully developed sense of what it's like to be another person, the first thing you do is you connect with the person that speaks to your personality most. And then as I've grown and have been able to understand people who aren't as much like me, I relate to other characters more. And I'm more curious about them and wonder more even about the more secondary characters like Hannah and the Hummels and the Kings and the Moffats. Mr. Lawrence is such an important part of the story, yet I never really thought about him that much till this last time.
I'm sure we will get into Mr. Lawrence when we are discovering this chapter, because he appears in the end. But I think that's a good point, because I can really tell who is the sister that I identify with most. It's like a lot of people do. I am like Amy. I am like Joe. But for me, it just keeps changing, or I identify with some part of each of them.
Yes, absolutely.
I can read this first paragraph. So this takes place during the time when Joe and Laurie are 15, and I believe Meg is 17. Little Woman chapter 21. Laurie makes mischief and Joe makes peace. Joe's face was a study next day, for the secret rather weighed upon her, and she found it hard not to look mysterious and important. Megs observed it, but did not trouble herself to make inquiries, for she had learned that the best way to manage Joe was by the law of contraries. So she felt sure of being told everything if she did not ask. She was rather surprised, therefore, when the silence remained unbroken, and Joe assumed a patronizing air which decidedly aggravated Meg, who in her turn assumed an air of dignified reserve and devoted herself to her mother. This left Joe to her own devices, for Mrs. March had taken her place as nurse, and bid her rest, exercise, and amuse herself after her long confinement. Amy being gone, Laurie was her only refuge, and much as she enjoyed his society, she rather dreaded him just then, for he was an incorrigible tease, and she feared he would coax her secret from her. This takes place when Beth has become ill, and Amy has been sent to Aunt March.
She was quite right, for the mischief-loving lad no sooner suspected a mystery than he set himself to find it out, and led Joe a trying life of it. He wheedled, bribed, ridiculed, threatened, and scolded, affected indifference that he might surprise the truth from her, declared he knew then that he didn't care, and at last, by dint of perseverance, he satisfied himself that it concerned Meg and Mr. Brooke. Feeling indignant that he was not taken into his tutor's confidence, he set his wits to work to devise some proper retaliation for the slight.
So Laurie knows that Mr. Brooke has feelings for Meg, and he keeps this as a secret from Joe, but he kind of wants Joe to find out.
Yes, I think that he tells her a little earlier that Mr. Brooke has Meg's other glove, right?
Yeah.
And, I think that was the chapter secrets after she had given her manuscript to the Spread Eagle newspaper.
Hello, friends. It is Niina from the Little Woman podcast. Just to let you all know that the Little Woman podcast episode transcripts are now available as books. You can find them as paperbacks and ebooks. They are wonderful reading for all the fans of Louisa May Alcott. You can find all the links from the description. And now, back to the show.
He found her out, and then they made an exchange of secrets. She confessed what she had done. He told her the secret that he knew where Meg's other glove was, and of course it upset poor Joe. Can't handle any change. I find it interesting that he feels indignant and slighted.
He can't keep a secret.
Not from him.
Meg, meanwhile, had apparently forgotten the matter and was absorbed in preparations for her father's return. But all of a sudden a change seemed to come over her, and for a day or two she was quite unlike herself. She started when spoken to, blushed when looked at, was very quiet, and sat over her sewing with a timid, troubled look on her face. To her mother's inquiries she answered that she was quite well, and Joe's she silenced by begging to be let alone. She feels it in the air, love I mean, and she's going very fast. She's got most of the symptoms. Is twittery and cross, don't eat, lies awake and mopes in corners. I got her singing that song about the silver-voiced brook, and once she said, John, as you do, and then turned as red as a poppy. Whatever shall we do? Said Joe, looking ready for any measures, however violent.
Nothing but wait. Let her alone. Be kind and patient, and Father's coming will settle everything, replied her mother. Here's a note to you, Meg, all sealed up. How odd. Teddy never seals mine, said Joe next day as she distributed the contents of the little post office. Mrs. March and Joe were deep in their own affairs when a sound from Meg made them look up to see her staring at her note with a frightened face.
My child, what is it? Cried her mother, running to her. while Joe tried to take the paper which had done the mischief. "It's all a mistake. He didn't send it. Oh, Joe, how could you do it?" And Meg hid her face in her hands, crying as if her heart was quite broken. "Me? I've done nothing." "What's the talking about?" cried Joe, bewildered. Meg's mild eyes kindled with anger as she put a crumpled note from her pocket and threw it at Joe, saying reproachfully, "You wrote it, and that bad boy helped you. How could you be so rude, so mean, and cruel to us both?" Joe hardly heard her, for she and her mother were reading the note, which was written in a peculiar hand.
"My dearest Margaret, I can no longer restrain my passion, and must know my fate before I return. I dare not tell your parents yet, but I think they would consent if they knew that we adored one another. Mr. Lawrence will help me to some good place, and then, my sweet girl, you will make me happy. I implore you to say nothing to your family yet, but to send one word of hope through Laurie to your devoted John." Oh, the little villain! That's the way he meant to pay me for keeping my word to Mother. I'll give him a hearty scolding, and bring him over to beg pardon, cried Joe, burning to execute immediate justice. But her mother held her back, saying with a look she seldom wore, "Stop, Joe. You must clear yourself first. You have played so many pranks that I am afraid you have had a hand in this." "On my word, Mother, I haven't. I never saw that note before, and don't know anything about it, as true as I live," said Joe so earnestly that they believed her. "If I had taken a part in it, I'd have done it better than this, and have written a sensible note. I should think you'd have known Mr. Brooke wouldn't write such stuff as that," she added, scornfully tossing down the paper. "It's like his writing," faltered Meg, comparing it with the note in her hand. "Oh, Meg, you didn't answer it," cried Mrs. March quickly. "Yes, I did," and Meg hid her face again, overcome with shame. "Here's a scrape. Do let me bring that wicked boy over to explain and be lectured. I can't rest till I get hold of him." And Joe made a rush for the door again.
What always makes me angry in this chapter is that Meg actually replied to this letter.
Yeah, she wouldn't have had any reason to suspect, being the person that she is, and never having experienced this kind of subterfuge before, to have second-guessed the note. So, yeah, she just fell right into it.
It's typical catfishing.
It's really neat.
Yes. I once read an analysis on this chapter, and I can't remember the name of the Alcott schooler, but they basically said that if this would happen to any person who is 17-year-old today, they would feel as humiliated as Meg does.
Yeah, it's a perfectly understandable reaction that Laurie just doesn't, he does not think it through. All he's thinking about is how he feels slighted, he felt excluded, and it's about him basically getting revenge. Teaching a lesson like, oh, if you're going to leave me out, I'm going to figure it out anyway, and it's like nothing else matters.
Yeah, it's really intrusion to Meg's privacy, and he doesn't get it. Hush, let me manage this, for it is worse than I thought. Margaret, tell me the whole story, commanded Miss March, sitting down by Meg, yet keeping hold of Joe, lest she should fly off. I received the first letter from Laurie, who didn't look as if he knew anything about it, began Meg without looking up. I was worried at first, and meant to tell you. Then I remembered how you liked Mr. Brooke, so I thought you wouldn't mind if I kept my little secret for a few days. I'm so silly that I like to think no one knew, and while I was deciding what to say, I felt like the girls in books, who have such things to do. Forgive me, Mother. I am paid for my silliness now. I never can look him in the face again. What did you say to him? Asked Miss March. I only said I was too young to do anything about it yet, that I didn't wish to have secrets from you, and he must speak to Father. I was very grateful for his kindness, and would be his friend, but nothing more for a long while. Miss March smiled, as if well pleased, and Joe clapped her hands, exclaiming with a laugh, You are almost equal to Caroline Percy. who was a pattern of prudence. Tell on, Meg, what did he say to that? I actually went to Google Caroline Percy. She's a character from a 19th century book called Patronage.
By Maria Edgeworth.
Yes. Have you read it?
No, it's like 4 volumes. I find the idea very daunting. But I was surprised and pretty delighted to learn that there's a segment in that story where she receives 2 letters written by the same hand that causes some issues. And so I thought, well, that's hilarious. I mean, of course, only anybody who was familiar with the story would know, and a modern audience would have to do the deep dive. It just broadened my appreciation for her even more, that Louisa includes the pop culture in her story, and that detail is kind of a big deal.
I didn't know that, but there's a nice intertextuality there, that she takes parts of this literature that she was reading and was popular at the time.
Yeah, and one of the things, too, that I'm appreciating more this time around is how Pilgrim's Progress, Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress fits into this whole thing, how it influenced the structure of the first half of the book. I knew it, but I didn't really observe it or study it as much as I have during this last reading.
That is really interesting. He writes in a different way entirely, telling me that he never sent any love letter at all, and is very sorry that my rockish sister, Jo, should take such liberties with our names. It's very kind and respectful, but think how dreadful for me. So, yeah.
It's so mean, and I hate to laugh,
This doesn't sound like Laurie is in love with Jo. This sounds more like Laurie's teasing Jo as well.
Yeah, that's what it's all about. It's like, hey, you're not telling me what I think I should know, so I'm going to basically torture you. I'm going to torture it out of you any way I can, and it doesn't matter how. As a matter of fact, it's funny to me. He thinks it's funny.
Yeah.
He just calls it a joke or a prank. It's like, no, it's me. Meg leaned against her mother, looking the image of despair, and Jo tramped about the room, calling Laurie names. All of a sudden she stopped, caught up the 2 notes, and after looking at them closely said decidedly, I don't believe Brooke ever saw either of these letters. Teddy wrote both, and keeps yours to crow over me with, because I wouldn't tell him my secret. Don't have any secrets, Jo. Tell it to Mother, and keep out of trouble as I should have done, said Meg warningly. Bless you, child. Mother told me. That will do, Jo. I'll comfort Meg while you go and get Laurie. I shall sift the matter to the bottom and put a stop to such pranks at once. Away ran Jo, and Mrs. March gently told Meg Mr. Brooks' real feelings. Now, dear, what are your own? Do you love him enough to wait till he can make a home for you? Or will you keep yourself quite free for the present? I've been so scared and worried. I don't want to have anything to do with the lovers for a long while. Perhaps never, answered Meg petulantly. If John doesn't know anything about this nonsense, don't tell him, and make Jo and Laurie hold their tongues. I won't be deceived and plagued and made a fool of. It's a shame.
I really love Meg in this chapter. She knows her self-worth. Seeing that Meg's usually gentle temper was roused, and her pride hurt by this mischievous joke, Mrs. March soothed her by promises of entire silence and great discretion for the future. The instant Laurie's step was heard in the hall, Meg fled into the study, and Mrs. March received the culprit alone. Jo had not told him why he was wanted, fearing he wouldn't come. But he knew the minute he saw Mrs. March's face, and stood twirling his hat with a guilty air, which convicted him at once. Jo was dismissed, but chose to march up and down the hall like a sentinel, having some fear that the prisoner might bolt. The sound of voices in the parlour rose and fell for half an hour, but what happened during that interview the girls never knew. When they were called in, Laurie was standing by their mother with such a benignant face that Joe forgave him on the spot, but did not think it wise to betray the fact. Meg received his humble apology and was much comforted by the assurance that Brooke knew nothing of the joke.
I don't know about you, but I think that Joe did the right thing to not tell Laurie that she forgave him on the spot.
That's probably true.
For a while. I'll never tell him to my dying day. Wild horses shan't drag it out of me. So you'll forgive me, Meg, and I'll do anything to show how out and out sorry I am, he added, looking very much ashamed of himself. I'll try, but it was a very ungentlemanly thing to do. I didn't think you could be so sly and malicious, Laurie, replied Meg, trying to hide her maidenly confusion under a gravely reproachful air. It was altogether abominable, and I don't deserve to be spoken to for a month. But you will, though, won't you? And Laurie folded his hands together with such an imploring gesture as he spoke in his irresistibly persuasive tone that it was impossible to frown upon him in spite of his scandalous behavior. Meg pardoned him, and Mrs. March's grave face relaxed in spite of her efforts to keep sober, when she heard him declare that he would atone for his sins by all sorts of penances, and abase himself like a worm before the injured damsel. Jo stood aloof, meanwhile, trying to harden her heart against him, and succeeding only in priming up her face into an expression of entire disapprobation. Laurie looked at her once or twice, but as she showed no sign of relenting, he felt injured and turned his back on her till the others were done with him, when he made her a low bow and walked out without a word. There he is, he's injured again, like now it's about him.
When I was reading this again for this chat, this chapter kind of reminded me of Laurie's proposal to Joe. Because there we have...
You just can't take no for an answer.
Exactly. Like, he's injured, and Joe feels bad for him. And it's like this whole chapter is like, once again, Joe having these maternal feelings for him, like she is his little mother. And that's why Joe can't really see faults in Laurie's behavior, even when he is hurting her sister. As soon as he had gone, she wished she had been more forgiving, and when Meg and her mother went upstairs, she felt lonely and longed for Teddy. After resisting for some time, she yielded the impulse and, armed with a book to return, went over to the big house. "Is Mr. Lawrence in?" asked Joe of a housemaid who was coming downstairs. "Yes, miss, but I don't believe he's seeable just yet." "Why not? Is he ill?" "La, no, miss. He's had a scene with Mr. Laurie, who is in one of his tantrums about something, which vexes the old gentleman, so I doesn't go nigh him." "Where is Laurie?" "Shut up in his room, and he won't answer though I've been a-tapping. I don't know what's to become of the dinner, for it's ready, and there's no one to eat it." "I'll go and see what the matter is. I'm not afraid of either of them." Up went Joe and knocked smartly on the door of Laurie's little study. "Stop that, or I'll open the door and make you," called out the young gentleman in a threatening tone. Joe immediately knocked again. The door flew open, and in she bounced before Laurie could recover from his surprise. Joe, who knew how to manage him, assumed a contrite expression, and going artistically down upon her knees, said meekly, "Please forgive me for being so cross. I came to make it up, and can't go away till I have." "It's all right. Get up. Don't be a goose, Joe," was the cavalier reply to her petition. "Thank you, I will. Could I ask what's the matter? You don't look exactly easy in your mind." "I've been shaken, and I won't bear it," growled Laurie indignantly. "Who did it?" demanded Joe. "Grandfather. If it had been anyone else, I'd have—" And the injured youth finished his sentence by an energetic gesture of the right arm.
That's nothing. I often shake you when you don't mind, said Joe soothingly. Pooh, you're a girl and it's fun, but I'll allow no man to shake me. Why were you treated so? Just because I wouldn't say what your mother wanted me for. I'd promised not to tell, and of course I wasn't going to break my word. Couldn't you satisfy your grandpa in another way? No, you would have the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I'd have told my part of the scrape, if I could, without bringing Meg in. As I couldn't, I held my tongue, bore the scolding till the old gentleman collared me. Then I got angry and bolted for fear I should forget myself. It wasn't nice, but he's sorry, I know, so go down and make up. I'll help you. Hanged if I do. I'm not going to be lectured and pummeled by everyone just for a bit of a frolic. I was sorry about Meg and begged pardon like mad, but I won't do it again when I wasn't in the wrong. He didn't know that. He ought to trust me and not act as if I was a baby. It's no use, Joe. He's got to learn that I'm able to take care of myself and don't need anyone's apron string to hold on by. It's so full of contradictions, isn't it? He says it was just a bit of a frolic, but then he claims he is sorry about Meg, and he behaves so, all this indignation all the way through this whole chapter. And yet, he's a man, he's not a baby, but he's having a tantrum.
Oh. But it's like, I wasn't in the wrong. How is that possible?
Yeah. Well, his grandfather doesn't know anything about the details of the situation, but he knows Laurie well enough to know that he was in the wrong about something.
Yes. This is not in any Little Woman movies, this chapter. But
no,
it is
kind of a big deal.
Yeah, well, they want to romanticize Joe and Laurie, which is pretty weird in my opinion. But this is in the BBC Little Woman series from 1970. And it's really disturbing because it really tries to portray that it was all Meg's fault, which it wasn't.
In the 70s version?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, I haven't seen that version yet, but that's very 70s of them, isn't it?
I agree.
That is so ironic.
I mean, that version, it doesn't really do that well with Joe and Frederick, and not always with Joe and Laurie. I think it does really good job with Amy and Laurie, but this book was written in 1867, and then we have 1970s version, which kind of flips this upside down, and it's not good.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah.
Well, I have to watch that one someday. I've definitely not seen it. Was it included in the one with Maya Hawk? What was that one?
I don't think so. I don't think it was included.
I haven't seen that one, and that one was an actual miniseries, right?
Yes.
So there was time.
Mm-hmm. I think the Maya Hawke version, it really romanticizes Laurie, which is not really a surprise, but it's not very good if you want to do justice for the book.
No. Or allow people to mature.
Yes.
It's like they keep these versions, these film versions, keep both Joe and Laurie boxed in at 15 or 16, and just don't want them to grow up for some reason. Maybe because of that kind of more youthful exuberance that keeps the first half of the book kind of light and more fun than not.
It's problematic because if you don't see Laurie's growth, then you don't understand why he ends up with Amy. And it's such an important thing, in my opinion, that Louisa May Alcott included Laurie's this full growth process from a boy into a man. In the end of Little Woman, he actually apologizes to Jo that he was harassing her earlier.
He comes around. He does learn. He's the fifth sibling.
And it was something that I was actually discussing with another person for this podcast earlier, that the way Jo is written to be in this chapter is very different than Jo in Jo's Boys, where she's like in her 50s, 40s. And then there is this scene where Jo lectures these young men because they are harassing some of the female students. But if that Jo would have been like this 15-year-old Jo, then Jo would have probably said that it was actually this girl's fault that these guys were harassing her. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. Yes. I feel like Jo and Laurie are peers. And they have as much to learn, as the other. And they're so similar. This comes up throughout, particularly the first half of the book. It comes up a lot. Like Marmee mentions it to her, how similar Jo and Laurie are, and they talk about how, in some ways, that's why they have so much fun together. But in other ways, it's not always helpful, because they're just going to reinforce the worst parts of the other.
Yeah, it's that toxic masculinity.
Yes. It's what you mentioned before, which I think is important to recognize in Jo as much as in Laurie.
Yes, and then when the second half of the book begins, Jo slowly starts to grow out of him.
Yeah, she grows before he does. And her refusal of his marriage proposal shows us that. And the way he responds to it shows how far behind her that he actually is as far as growth goes. And yet, that refusal is pivotal in his character arc, in his growth. It's because of that refusal that he grows as much as he does, I think.
I agree. Because he goes to Europe and then he's miserable there. And then I think that lecture that Amy gives to him, it really starts this process of him trying to find something from himself that he hadn't discovered yet.
Yes, plus I think that it's good for him to hear no now and then.
Yes. His grandfather tries to say no to him, but he really can't. I think it's because he lost his own son, and then he has Laurie left. So. But pepperpots you are, sighed Jo. How do you mean to settle this affair? Well, he ought to beg pardon, and believe me when I say I can't tell him what the row's about. Bless you, he won't do that. I won't go down till he does. Now, Teddy, be sensible. Let it pass, and I'll explain what I can. You can stay here, so what's the use of being melodramatic? I don't intend to stay here long anyway. I'll slip off and take a journey somewhere, and when Grandpa misses me, he'll come round fast enough. I dare say, but you ought not to go and worry him. Don't preach. I'll go to Washington and see Brooke. It's gay there, and I'll enjoy myself after the troubles. What fun you'd have. I wish I could run off too, said Jo, forgetting her part of mentor in lively visions of martial life at the Capitol. Come on then, why not? You go and surprise your father, and I'll stir up old Brooke. It would be a glorious joke. Let's do it, Jo. We'll leave a letter saying we are all right and trot off at once. I've got money enough. It will do you good and be no harm as you go to your father.
For a moment, Jo looked as if she would agree, for wild as the plan was, it just suited her. She was tired of care and confinement, longed for change, and thoughts of her father blended temptingly with the novel charms of camps and hospitals, liberty and fun. Her eyes kindled as they turned wistfully toward the window, but they fell on the old house opposite, and she shook her head with sorrowful decision. If I was a boy, we'd run away together and have a capital time. But, as I'm a miserable girl, I must be proper and stop at home. Don't tempt me, Teddy. It's a crazy plan. That's the fun of it, began Laurie, who had got a willful fit on him and was possessed to break out of bounds in some way. Hold your tongue, cried Jo, covering her ears. Prunes and prisms are my doom, and I may as well make up my mind to it. I came here to moralize, not to hear about things that make me skip to think of. I know Meg would wet blanket such a proposal, but I thought you had more spirit, began Laurie insinuatingly. Bad boy, be quiet. Sit down and think of your own sins. Don't go making me out to mine. If I get your grandpa to apologize for the shaking, will you give up running away? Asked Jo seriously. Yes, but you won't do it, answered Laurie, who wished to make up, but felt that his outraged dignity must be appeased first. If I can manage the young one, I can the old one, muttered Jo as she walked away, leaving Laurie bent over a railroad map with his head propped up on both hands.
This still sounds like she is trying to mother him.
Exactly.
This part where she says that if I was a boy, we'd run away together and have a capital time, but as I am a miserable girl, I must be proper and stop at home. There's something similar that she says in the chapter when she and Laurie meet and he has the sore throat. I think I wrote it here. Jo says, why don't you invite girls? Girls are quiet and like to play nurses. Like she doesn't have a very favorable view of her gender.
Even though she does like nursing.
Yes, and Louisa May Alcott was a trained nurse, so I think this is interesting.
She was, and that's one of the things I find fascinating, too, about this chapter, is that she was in Washington. Mm-hmm. She did go, she didn't have to imagine it or wish she were there as a young lady, but as a mature woman, she actually was there.
You have been reading hospital sketches.
Yes, I read it. It's pretty quick. It's not a long read. Well, I think I can see how, I know I can see now after having read it, why it's cited as the piece of writing where she found her voice. It's energetic, it's witty, it deals with serious topics, but it's just a quick, lively, enjoyable, thought-provoking read. Just like Little Women is.
I will add it to my long reading list. Wasn't that
one of your quicker ones?
Yeah. Wasn't the guy in hospital sketches like Friedrich, the German soldier?
There's a gentleman who is mortally wounded that they make a reference to, and I think his name is Dan. And he comes up periodically in among scholars, and there is a Prussian. He is helpful, very, very helpful to her when she runs into a problem with a delirious patient. And he comes up a couple of times, but he doesn't factor in as powerfully as the mortally wounded soldier who passes.
Yes.
So, I kind of wonder, there's a lot of things that when you read it, you will be able to see, oh, here's a name, or here's a phrase, or, you will recognize them because they show up later in Little Women, and you can see the influence of even her own writing on Little Women, beginning with hospital sketches.
I believe the soldier she was nursing, it was actually based on a real soldier who Louisa May Alcott took care of.
Yes. Yeah.
One of those pretty rare prototypes, I believe. If I can manage the young one, I can the old one, muttered Jo, as she walked away, leaving Laurie bent over on a railroad map with his head propped up on both hands. Come in, and Mr. Lawrence's gruff voice sounded gruffer than ever as Jo tapped at his door. It's only me, sir. Come to return a book, she said blandly as she entered. Want any more? Asked the old gentleman, looking grim and vexed, but trying not to show it. Yes, please. I like the old Sam so well. I think I'll try the second volume, returned Jo, hoping to propitiate him by accepting a second dose of Boswell's Johnson, as he had recommended that lively work. The shaggy eyebrows unbent a little as he rode the steps toward the shelf where the Johnsonian literature was placed. Jo skipped up and, sitting on the top step, affected to be searching for her book, but was really wondering how best to introduce the dangerous objects of her visit. Mr. Lawrence seemed to suspect that something was brewing in her mind, for after taking several brisk turns about the room, he faced round on her, speaking so abruptly that Rossella's tumbled face downward on the floor. What has that boy been about? Don't try to shield him now. I know he has been in mischief. By the way he acted when he came home. I can't get a word from him. And when I threatened to shake the truth out of him, he bolted upstairs and locked himself into his room.
He did do wrong, but we forgave him. And all promised not to say a word to anyone. Aunt Jo relaxed. That won't do. He shall not shelter himself behind a promise from you soft-hearted girls. If he's done anything in this, he shall confess, beg a pardon, and be punished. Out with it, Jo. I won't be kept in the dark. Mr. Lawrence looked so alarming and spoke so sharply that Jo would have gladly run away if she could, but she was perched aloft on the steps, and he stood at the foot, a lion in the path, so she had to stay and brave it out. Indeed, sir, I cannot tell. Mother forbade it. Laurie has confessed, asked pardon, and been punished quite enough. We don't keep silence to shield him, but someone else, and it will make more trouble if you interfere. Please don't. It was partly my fault, but it's all right now, so let's forget it and talk about the Rambler for something pleasant. Hang the Rambler. Come down and give me your word that this harum-scarum boy of mine hasn't done anything ungrateful or impertinent. If he has, after all your kindness to him, I'll thrash him with my own hands. The threat sounded awful, but did not alarm Jo, for she knew the irascible old gentleman would never lift a finger against his grandson, whatever he might say to the contrary. She obediently descended, and made as light of the prank as she could without betraying Meg, or forgetting the truth. See, there you go, right? His threats are they don't mean anything. I'm surprised he shook him.
Yeah, they go to deaf ears.
Yes. He understands Laurie very well, but he's a grandfather. He's not a parent. And there's a lot of history between that was there that had nothing to do with Laurie, but's connected to Laurie, and, whatever else he may be going through, whatever his emotions may be, we only really learn of them through Marmee, and it only comes up maybe once or twice, kind of in passing. So, I mean, there's a piece of fan fiction for you, Mr. Lawrence.
I think he's kind of trying to build a relationship with him, but he's not very successful, at least in the beginning. Laurie doesn't really know his grandfather when he moves to Concord. Like, they have been living together only for a while now. And we don't know if he went to see him when he was living in Europe. And somebody commented once that if this prank that Laurie made would have gone out and then people would talk that John was actually courting Meg, it might have had a very negative impact on John. He might have been fired and Meg might have lost her reputation because she was 17.
I had never thought of that.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about because people gotta expect Meg to marry a rich man.
Jo even harbors an idea in her mind that at one time that Laurie and Meg would hook up. But she does that again with Beth.
Yes.
She's always hooking everybody up with Laurie except for herself.
That's because she wants Laurie to be her brother.
Yes, yes.
It was interesting because somebody asked me about this, like, isn't that like contradicting to Jo's character? Why would Louisa May Alcott do that? But then I was thinking, well, if she really had this incredible maternal feelings for all the boys in the world, I don't think she necessarily saw anything wrong with that. Jo wanting to marry Laurie to any one of her sisters except herself.
Exactly. It would just automatically make him the brother she already wants him to be. Solve the problem.
And maybe it's because we are seeing these movie versions where Jo and Laurie are so romanticized. And maybe it's also because of our culture, really, that we, when I first read the book, the first times, and I thought it was a bit weird that Jo wanted to marry Laurie to Meg, and now I wonder maybe it was really something that Louisa May Alcott didn't see there wasn't any problems for her, if she really felt that for boys, and I think she did. I once read from one of her biographies that when she had this fling with Larry Wisniewski, they really did pranks together. Like, they loved pranking people, and that's just Jo and Laurie type of thing to do. I can't see anything romantic there, but it's one of those things that people just like to ignore.
Yes, I've never found in any romantic literature a hero and heroine linked together through pranking.
Maybe it doesn't exist. Maybe it's just Jo and Laurie.
Yeah, that's it. And, I think maybe, too, now that we're discussing it a little bit more, that the difference in tone or mood between the first half and the second half of the book. The second half is such a stark contrast as far as lightness and energy, and there's still wit, and her writing style is still lively, but it's harder, it's sadder, it's darker. They're older, and so people definitely gravitate more toward the first half of the book and that relationship. They just can't let it go.
Yes, and it's interesting because one of my friends said this, that, she read the book after seeing the 2019 film, and then she was surprised because in this first part, there's nothing romantic between Jo and Laurie, and she was expecting things to be romantic because Greta Gerwig said so. But we know that Greta Gerwig lied to people, so none of that exists here. I think a lot of the movies, they kind of set people to disappointment when they want to romanticize Jo and Laurie, because there really isn't anything romantic between them.
No, and I'd really like Greta to kind of point out any passage that suggests that. I don't think that she'll be able to do it.
No, she also said that Jo hated Germans, or Louisa May Alcott hated Germans. Yeah, another lie. None of that ever happens.
Well, that's just out and out propaganda.
I agree. And it's just these contradictory things that she said that never happens in the book. So I'm not surprised that people have such weird views about Little Women, because I don't think most people who write adaptations have actually read it.
Nor did people of that time wear Uggs in the snow.
I actually read from letters that Louisa May Alcott wrote with Maggie Lukens, the Lukens sisters. You know that one? No, they were like fans of her books. So the sisters, they had this letter exchange with Louisa May Alcott. And I read some of them, and they were really interesting because the girls were like, we were heartbroken that Jo rejected Laurie, and we were sad to see her grow and stuff like that. And then Louisa May Alcott answered, why is it that people think that Jo remains as a child when in the end of the book she's 30? And I thought that was interesting because people are so obsessed with Jo staying this teenager who, in my opinion, is not really a smart or admirable person, especially in this chapter. Little Woman Part 2 is really underappreciated because of that. People are so hanged on into things that I don't think are very admirable in the end.
And that's the whole point of the first half, isn't it? Even the second half, is that they're full of faults. Those are their burdens. The burdens they carry in their own pilgrimage to adulthood is that they have these faults. And I think if Laurie had been a part of that whole pilgrimage, if he was as aware of it, then maybe his burdens could have included, well, I'm spoiled, and it's easy for me to feel slighted. I take offense easily, among other things that I'm sure you could add a number of things that would be put into his knapsack as his burdens. But we don't have that experience of it being spelled out for us the way that we do for Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy. And so we kind of have to do the work and put that together with all the clues that she leaves us, because we have to be a little more astute in our reading to understand Laurie's own arc. But it's all here.
Thank you so much for watching. Kymberly and I continue our chat next time. Take care and make good choices. Bye.
Because I have this distinguished memory of reading this chapter when I was 17, and I was mad for him for months, maybe years, because of this chapter. But it was also because I was 17 at the time, and I would very, very much relate to Meg. But it was much later when I read the book again, and I started to see, oh, he actually grows out of this. But definitely I had some resentment against Laurie at the time. When I have been speaking about this chapter in the podcast, I've had a lot of people saying that, oh yeah, when they read this part, it was weird for them how people could call Jo as a feminist because she doesn't really react in the way they want her to react. But that's really the whole point of the book, because Jo really grows to become a feminist in later novels. And we have characters like Fredrik and her mother who help her to become that person.
Yes, and Marmee also has Laurie pretty pegged. She's fully aware. She refers to him as a weathercock, and recognizes that he's pretty immature. And she steps up, though, and she is a good influence upon him. He would probably, and did, I think, accept, well, obviously, as this chapter shows us, he doesn't shake Marmee or go stomping off before she finishes telling him off in their private conversation. He becomes contrite. He thinks about it. She does a lot for him. This family is very important to Laurie and is an integral part of his maturation process. I think without them, he would have been just lost. He would have become like the king boy who gambled away the family's money or some of the family's money anyway. The king boy that was a member of the family that Meg is a governess to.
Laurie sees Marmee as, like a surrogate mother, but I think it's also, he doesn't stand against Marmee because I think deep down inside he knows that Marmee is actually the healthy mother figure for him, because she can put those boundaries that even his grandfather can't put on him. And she's like also one of those people who says no to him.
Yeah, she points out to him, you did wrong here, bud. And he has to take it. Well, he doesn't have to, but he does. To the best of his ability. I mean, as we read, we can see that he's still, vacillating.
Yes. Well, if the boy held his tongue because he'd promised and not from obstinacy, I'll forgive him. He's a stubborn fellow and hard to manage, said Mr. Lawrence, rubbing up his hair till it looked as if he'd been out in a gale and smoothing the frown from his brow with an air of relief. So am I, but a kind word will govern me, when all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't, said Jo, trying to say a kind word for her friend, who seemed to get out of one scrape only to fall into another. You think I am too kind to him, eh? Was the sharp answer. Oh dear, no, sir, you are rather too kind sometimes. And then just a trifle hasty when he tries your patience. Don't you think you are? Jo was determined to have it out now, and tried to look quite placid. She quaked a little after her bold speech. To her great relief and surprise, the old gentleman only threw his spectacles on the table with a rattle and exclaimed frankly, You are right, girl. I am. I love the boy, but he tries my patience past bearing, and I don't know how it will end, and if we go on so. I'll tell you, he'll run away. Jo was sorry for that speech the minute it was made. She meant to warn him that Laurie would not bear much restraint, and hoped he would be more forbearing with the lad.
Mr. Lawrence's ruddy face changed suddenly, and he sat down with a troubled glance at the picture of a handsome man which hung over his table. It was Laurie's father, who had run away in his youth and married against the imperious old man's will. Jo fancied he remembered and regretted the past, and she wished she had held her tongue. He won't do it unless he is very much worried, and only threatens it sometimes when he gets tired of studying. I often think I should like to, especially since my hair was cut. So, if you ever miss us, you may advertise for 2 boys and look among the ships bound for India. She laughed as she spoke, and Mr. Lawrence looked relieved, evidently taking the whole as a joke. You hussy, how dare you talk in that way? Where is your respect for me and your proper bringing up? Bless the boys and girls, what torments they are, yet we can't do without them, he said, pinching her cheeks good-humoredly. Go and bring that boy down to his dinner. Tell him it's all right, and advise him not to put on tragedy airs with his grandfather. I won't bear it. He won't come, sir. He feels badly because you didn't believe him when he said he couldn't tell. I think the shaking hurt his feelings very much. Jo tried to look pathetic, but must have failed, for Mr. Lawrence began to laugh, and she knew the day was won.
See, Mr. Lawrence like a businessman who owns cargo ships that take stuff to India and other parts of the world. So Laurie basically could travel to India with Joe in a ship. But they are way too young to do that. And honestly, I don't think Joe even would like to go.
She's so family-oriented, no matter how tempting an offer may be, the minute she remembers family, that's where she will be.
Yes. And even when she's in New York, which is kind of her big adventure, she really just hangs out with Fredrik there. Like, she doesn't go to do whatever people did in New York in 19th century.
Yeah, particularly once she ends her writing stint there. Then, he's pretty much her only society by choice.
Yes.
She likes how he grounds her. She feels connected to her family through him. The things that matter, that anchor her, that the family offers, religious-wise, moral-wise, he represents those things. And it helps her so much.
Yes, and then Fredrik represents that kind of world that Joe is fascinated. Like Goethe and German literature and all these things that she's interested from. And it's kind of nice that I noticed here that Ode, Mr. Lawrence, and then Joe, they speak a lot about books. They speak about The Rambler and Boswell's Johnson. And it kind of reminded me how Louisa May Alcott wrote about her discussions about books with Emerson.
I have been wondering if Mr. Lawrence may be part of that, if Emerson might be represented by portions of Mr. Lawrence because of that.
I believe all these characters in Little Woman who sort of connect Joe and literature, like Fredrik and Ode, Mr. Lawrence, they have some kind of connection to Emerson, and it's not necessarily conscious thing from Louisa May Alcott, maybe more subconscious.
Yeah. Yes. Right. Although I think in her later years, when she was struggling with moods and trying to write that great piece that she always felt was on her horizon, never fully, I think, accepting the moral pact for the young, as she put the Little Women series and the other books that she wrote for kids or younger people. She blamed Emerson for keeping her so bound to a certain kind of morality that should be fit into writing. And she was like, oh my gosh, I'm just so almost constricted by it. And maybe she was, but clearly what she was able to do, probably because of it, isn't something I'm going to be doing any day soon in this lifetime. I mean, there's nothing wrong, as we were talking about earlier, with writing books for young people. As a matter of fact, I think that that's probably one of the most important artistic things that you could offer, are some good reading material for young people. We need more of it.
Yes. And it's kind of funny because then she also has written that Emerson was her Goethe and her biggest writing inspiration. So there's lots of contradictings there. When I have read Louisa May Alcott's adult books, I think they are some way moralistic babble as well, to a certain extent. But I think the children book structure was something that she found limited sometimes, which I understand, because I think Lucy Maud Montgomery also said something similar, that you cannot fully express yourself in those books that were meant for young audience.
I imagine it would be easier to write books for younger people as an author that is known for writing for adults than it would the other way around. Reese and Doc is known for his books for children. If he suddenly decided, I want to write an adult piece of fiction, it probably just wouldn't have as willing a readership. People would be like, what? But say if who's a good, if John Grisham decided, I'm going to write a children's book and grabbed you to be the artist, it would probably do okay. So maybe in a way she got trapped. Even though she had those earlier successes with her thrillers, they were either anonymous or under Bernard, right? Her pen name. So, and she and her publisher went out of their way to create a persona that Louisa May Alcott was a brand. And it was a brand for moral pap for the young.
Yeah, so in a way she kind of sold herself to the children book genre with that brand. So I wouldn't blame that much on Emerson.
No, she might have just been flailing. Why am I stuck in this? It's Emerson's fault.
And it's so funny because I think her personal resentment for Little Woman had more to do with the reputation of Little Woman, because they so heavily identified Louisa as Jo and all these other characters with her family members. And even just like that letter from the sisters that, why couldn't Jo just stay as 15-year-old? And then when her fans came to see her, they were disappointed that she didn't look like what they imagined Jo to be, a 15-year-old girl with pigtails. And those were like adult women who came to see her and said that. Yeah, I don't know. I always thought that was quite strange.
Yes, it seems to transcend the generations though, doesn't it? It's like from then to now, we just want to freeze Jo at 15.
Everyone except me, because I always thought Good Wives was better than part 1.
Oh, man, it is so rich. It is. I think it's just for the rest of us who are ready to get on with it and to look at all of life, head on, because she does. She really does.
I think it really might be because I really got into Little Woman more when I was in my late teens, and the characters in Good Wives are in their late teens, and then they grow into adulthood, so I could identify more with that storyline than with the first part.
I really appreciate their growth because, I mean, again, I'm going to repeat what I already said earlier, which is that it's about them overcoming their flaws. And so we all have them. And never are we completely perfect, but to develop self-awareness and to peck away at our flaws is a noble thing to do. It's as far as I can tell, it's a humble way to operate in the world. And I really appreciate, especially I think Amy does this for us. If you're as a reader can't forgive Amy for having burnt Jo's book well into the second half of the book, if you're still carrying that grudge against her, that says something about you.
I think it's also because of the adaptations, because they kind of erased the part where Jo is bullying Amy. So people are hang on into that grudge against Amy, but then they don't pay any attention to the reasons why she actually behaves the way she does.
So, I mean, the book is about making those kinds of mistakes and learning from them, not only as the person who made the mistake, but as the people affected by the mistake you made. Just as in this chapter that we're reading now, Laurie has made a big mistake, and now he will slowly come to grapple with how it's affected everybody around him and how they respond to his mistake. Are they going to keep punishing him? Are they going to forgive him? So I think it's interesting that people can sit down and read a whole book and then still hold a mistake that a character made against them forever, when the whole idea of the book is, yes, we make mistakes and they affect others. And how are we going to behave as the people who made the mistake, or how are we going to behave toward the person who made the mistake that has affected us? Which I think is a big lesson for now. Huge. We have a hard time with forgiveness.
And this chapter especially, I think it's very much MeToo material.
Yes.
And yet, I don't hold this against Laurie because he is 15 and he grows out of this. But obviously, if he had stayed as this person, then it would be a problem.
Yeah. As it is, it can be a teachable moment, a learning moment. And Amy learns from the book burning thing. I mean, it shows up where she apologizes for it again in Amy's will, that chapter where she's staying with Aunt March, and she apologizes for it again. And there's some people who think she never apologized enough. Like, what do you want her to do? She can't take it back. How do we proceed?
There's actually a theory that Amy burning Joe's book is actually Louisa May Alcott censoring herself, which I thought was very interesting, because when Joe writes that story again, it becomes a better story than the one that was burned. That would be an interesting point of view, that maybe it was actually completely, well, obviously it was intentional from Louisa May Alcott's part, because it's a lesson of humility to Joe not to bully Amy, which nobody likes to speak about. But maybe there is also another reason for that book burning incident, because then in New York, Joe also burned some of her stories, the weekly volcano trash.
That's right.
So there is this continuity in the way Joe or Amy burns these stories, and then Joe develops as a writer, which I think it's something very interesting.
Yeah, that's a wonderful thing to think about.
I think the only version where we can see Joe clearly bullying Amy is the modern-day Little Woman version from the 2018.
Which one is that?
The one with Sarah Davenport as Joe.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I think I told you that I was surprised by that. I actually liked that version.
Yeah, I think it's really good because I think it was the only version that I have seen where I actually felt sorry for Amy when she burned Joe's book. It clearly showed that Joe had been bullying her, so she had a valid reason to burn the book, even though it wasn't really the right thing to do, but I understood her motives.
Like, it didn't come out of the blue. She didn't just do it for a frolic, as Laurie said.
No, she had actual reason to do it because Joe was really bullying her, and she does the same in the novel. But people just blame it on Amy, but there's a reason why Amy does things that she does.
And plus, in that chapter, they talk about how Louisa writes about how they go back and forth, and the family knows that it happens. And at one point, Joe's looking around trying to figure out, okay, what did she do? And, the last time that they had a tiff, Amy put one of her drawers upset one of her drawers and made a mess that way for Joe to clean up. So this was like a long-standing relationship of conflict between them. It didn't come out of the blue.
No. And it's a shame that people sort of put the blame on Amy when, well, you really need two people to have that kind of conflict.
I'm sorry for that, and ought to thank him for not shaking me, I suppose. What the dickens does a fellow expect? And the old gentleman looked a trifle ashamed of his own testiness. If I were you, I'd write him an apology, sir. He says he won't come down till he has one, and talks about Washington and goes on in an absurd way. A formal apology will make him see how foolish he is, and bring him down quite amiable. Try it. He likes fun, and this way is better than talking. I'll carry it up and teach him his duty.
Mr. Lawrence gave her a sharp look and put on his spectacles, saying slowly, "You're a sly puss, but I don't mind being managed by you and Beth. Here, give me a bit of paper and let us have done with this nonsense." The note was written in the terms which one gentleman would use to another after offering some deep insult. Joe dropped a kiss on the top of Mr. Lawrence's bald head and ran up to slip the apology under Laurie's door, advising him, through the keyhole, to be submissive, decorous, and a few other agreeable impossibilities. Finding the door locked again, she left the note to do its work and was going quietly away when the young gentleman slid down the banisters and waited for her at the bottom, saying with his most virtuous expression of countenance, "What a good fellow you are, Joe. Did you get blown up?" he added, laughing. "No, he was pretty clever on the whole. I got it all around. Even you cast me off over there, and I felt just ready to go to the D's," he began apologetically. "Don't talk in that way. Turn over a new leaf and begin again, Teddy, my son." "I keep turning over new leaves and spoiling them, as I used to spoil my copybooks, and I make so many beginnings there never will be an end," he said, dolefully. "She literally calls him my son."
Yes, I love that. I love that example of how she feels toward him. It's just right there. No mysteries.
Yep.
And I love, too, his confession. He's confiding in her that he makes so many beginnings, there will never be an end. That's like something that one of the sisters would say to a sister about their trials. So there he is with his little sack of burdens. Go and eat your dinner. You'll feel better after it. Men always croak when they're hungry. And Joe whisked out at the front door after that. "That's a label on my sect," answered Laurie, quoting Amy, as he went to partake of humble pie dutifully with his grandfather, who was quite saintly in temper and overwhelmingly respectful in manner all the rest of the day. Wait till you finish.
Everyone thought the matter ended, and the little cloud blown over, but the mischief was done, for, though others forgot it, Meg remembered. She never alluded to a certain person, but she thought of him a good deal, dreamed dreams more than ever, and once, Joe rummaging her sister's desk for stamps, found a bit of paper scribbled over with the words, "Mrs. John Brooke," whereat she groaned tragically and cast it into the fire, feeling that Laurie's prank had hastened the evil day for her. Mrs. John Brooke.
I think that this final, well, it's like the next to last paragraph, where it's mentioned that he went to partake of humble pie dutifully with his grandfather. That's what he needs to learn. He needs some humility, and this is a slice of it.
Yes, definitely.
So all in all, this is an important chapter for Laurie, as well as for Meg, poor Meg.
At this point, John is in Washington with Joe's father, is he? It's the chapter Camp Lawrence when we really start to see John's feelings for Meg when he tells the story of falling in love with the princess.
I love that chapter. That's one of my favorite chapters, and that film version that you just talked about, the more modernized version, is the only one that I know about, anyway, that includes anything about Camp Lawrence.
Yeah, the Maya Hawke version has bits of that, but I think it has all the wrong bits.
Yes, it's as though you need the theme. The theme is, it's more about growing up. It's a coming-of-age story. It's not a romance. It has romance in it, but that's incidental as a part of these people growing up.
And people say that, Joe must have hated marriage because she doesn't want John and Meg to marry. But then that's interesting because she also wants Meg to marry Laurie. So she doesn't really have anything against Meg marrying.
So what do you make of that?
I really don't know what's going on, to be honest.
I wonder if he's a stranger, and Jo is so fierce in her affections for family, and the Lawrences have become family to her. And then, as you were saying before about how she wants a brother, and she finds that in Laurie. And so, if Meg is going to marry anybody, you know how sometimes she will joke around and she says, well, I wish I could marry Meg myself, and then everything will be okay. She doesn't want to lose Meg. And I think maybe John Brooke she considers him an outsider.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because Laurie is familiar, then Meg would be married to someone who Joe knows, and still, like, Laurie wouldn't take Meg away.
Right, because he's already in the picture.
Yeah, that makes sense. I remember that Louisa May Alcott's sister, Anna Alcott, she married John Pratt, and they announced their engagement 1 month after Elizabeth had died. That happened in 1858, according to my notes. So that was 9 years before Little Woman was written. But I think Louisa kinda was able to tap into that feeling of your sister marrying. I don't know how well she knew John Pratt. I think they describe him as a family friend. But if you have just lost your sister, and your other sister is planning to get married, then you will be alone. Because May, I believe, was planning to move to Europe at the time. And she eventually did. Thus, this explains that fear that Jo has of being alone.
Yes. And having her very important family circle be penetrated by unwelcome sources. It's like, she's hard. She's hard. She doesn't take to just everybody.
And I think at that point, when you are 15, if there is a big change in family, it can really affect you because you are in that age when everything affects you.
Yes. And that's one of the things that definitely changes for at least me as a reader when Jo goes to New York, and how it just opens up, it just creates a bigger world, because she's just been bound to family up until then. It's good for her to get out of town, and it's good for us to get out of town with her.
And there's something familiar to Frederick that she finds in him. So he almost immediately becomes part of that family that she has. I mean, you can see that in the way she writes to Marmee, because all the letters are about him, essentially. She doesn't write like anything else in New York, it's all about him.
She doesn't even wonder if he would be accepted by the family. She knows that he will fit right in.
But then also when Jo goes to New York, she, in a way, tries to escape Laurie's advances. But I think it's also something that she does for herself, because she knows that essentially you need to leave. I think Louisa May Alcott's original name for Little Woman Part 2 was Leaving the Nest.
Oh, really?
Yes, which is actually pretty, well, exactly what you said about this. It's actually about growth, becoming your own person.
Jo also thinks, I don't know if she's just fooling herself or if this is a legitimate reason, but she may have hastily arrived at a conclusion that Beth was in love with Laurie because she was ready to go and she was ready to escape Laurie's advances. Also, maybe she needed a bigger excuse in her mind. Like, well, I think Beth's in love with him. Certainly, we know why Beth was upset. And we also know that Jo was nowhere near contemplating the loss of Beth at that time. So that was an easy conclusion for her to come to. Psychologically, helped her go and try something away from home, away from Laurie.
I think that Laurie was harassing her, even though Jo wouldn't use that word, but I think maybe it's because of that toxic masculinity or this fondness for boys in general. It wasn't really something that she wanted to admit to herself, that this is something that's happening. But then I think also, I don't think she wanted to admit to herself that Beth was really deadly ill.
No, I think it must have been, like the last thing. Any of them were, Beth had to come to terms with it before anyone else did. What a burden. Speaking of burdens, that's a big one. To shoulder that by yourself. That's something just in my life that I worry about with the people that I've known who've become extremely ill and are trying to put a good face on things. That's a tall order to place upon a person who really shouldn't have to shoulder that. And if you love that person, to me it seems like it's an important thing to extend to them is you don't have to do that for me. I'm here for you. What do you need? And it's just as much an emotional task as it is a physical one. Not even like, well, can I do dishes for you or can I make some meals for you? Yes, that's all well and good. But you don't have to put on a show for me to make me feel better. That's not what this is about. And Beth, she doesn't really have anybody like that for a while. I think Jo was the first person she confesses her knowledge to.
Yes. Maybe it's also because of Beth's nature. She doesn't like to worry others or be a burden.
That's the thing, is that, well, it's embedded in her personality and probably reinforced by the family dynamics. But, even to that dramatic degree, like where she is thinking about her own mortality and can't be a burden to anybody else when she really needs the most support, or at least acceptance.
It kind of goes along with Jo's arc, because she's always like, I don't need other people, when she actually does. Yes. Which we can see in the chapter All Alone, which I think is the saddest chapter in Little Woman. But I think it's also really important for chapter 4, Jo, when she admits that she doesn't want to be alone.
Right, but that doesn't mean she wants to go off and marry Laurie.
Yeah. That's not an option.
She doesn't even think of that.
It really begins from this letter that Amy sends to home and tells that she and Laurie are engaged. No, they are married, and Jo is happy for them, but she doesn't envy Laurie or Amy. She envies that they are not alone like she is.
It's a heavy chapter, and not something you see in the earlier half. It's very effective.
Definitely. Was that all we have to say about Laurie Makes Me Chief?
I love Laurie, but I'm not blinded by his faults any more than we're allowed to be blinded by the faults of the sisters. And I love that he has a character arc as much as the sisters do. And I think that it's unfair to Louisa's work that we overlook that just because it's not as obvious, even though it seems to me like it's pretty obvious. And I think it's an important message to us that we aren't perfect, that we have to develop self-awareness and try to make improvements, not be so blinded, by our emotions, our perspectives. It's like all the problems that arise in Little Women, Amy feeling slighted, Laurie feeling slighted, Jo feeling slighted, is pretty much the root of all of the scrapes, quote unquote, that they get into. The quickness that we tend to feel as human beings to feel slighted and defensive and then lash out. And then feeling some regret if we decide not to feel defensive about it and make excuses for it. It's good for us to regret our poor behavior and then try to do better next time.
Yeah, that's the whole point of being human, I think. You make mistakes and you grow from them.
And I think that that's one of the things that, or maybe is the theme that attracts people to Little Women to this day. This is just every man's story.
One of my friends said that if Laurie would have ended up with Jo in this book, Little Woman would not be famous. I wanted to hear your opinion about that. I think she has a point because, especially in part 2, a lot of the story is actually developed around that tension between Jo and Laurie, Amy and Fredrik.
My experience with that relationship, when I first read that book, I was 9. It never has once, since that first reading, occurred to me to second guess Jo's feelings or choices. It just never occurred to me. I just believed what she said, what I felt discomfort for her during Heartache. The chapter is called Heartache, where the proposal is, right?
Yes.
It was uncomfortable. I was with her every step of the way. I am with her every step of the way when she feels uncomfortable with his advances that she's noticing. And she's bashful about it. She doesn't think it's right for her, and she doesn't think it's right for him. They're mates, but they're not mates. And I never thought to question that. And so it's been a little bit of a surprise to me that it's become such a topic, particularly over these, seems to me, this last movie in particular, I think. I think that Greta Gerwig, it's as though she thinks that she is explaining, she's like Gerda-splaining Louisa May Alcott to us. And it's not even about Jo so much. I think it's about, I don't know what it's about. I don't know why she feels like she has to correct this story on behalf of Louisa that Louisa didn't even write. It's it doesn't make any sense to me.
I think it was all about money, honestly.
So you think that she was just delivering what she thought people wanted to see?
Yes. She said in one interview that Joe must be gay, in another interview that Joe must be asexual, in third interview that Joe must be with Laurie. So people can just pick and choose, which is so stupid. Because this is a semi-biographical story.
No, and she's consistent throughout the whole thing. If you sit down and read it, if you really read the book, just always go back to that. It's all there.
Or read Louisa May Alcott's quotes on Henry David Thoreau. Or Lady Wisniewski, which are really interesting because I think the things that she said to the public about Laddie are pretty different to the things that she wrote in her journals about him.
Oh, really?
Yes, because, when she spoke to the public and they were like, who is the real-life Laurie? Who is this story about? And she said, oh, it's this nice man I met in Switzerland. And then in her journals and in her letters with May, they call him boring. And then they wonder why he doesn't pay his money back to them.
Plus, there's another individual, too, that she claimed Laurie is based on.
Alf Whitman.
Yes, thank you. Now, how were they connected to him?
Alf was friend through their theater hobby, and I think he was also like 10 years younger than Louisa. He was like 15.
Like Laddie.
Yeah, he was like 15 when he met the Alcott sisters. And it's interesting because Alf and May were very good friends too.
Oh, that's just like May and Laddie too.
Yes, it has all the possibilities of a triangle, but it never was a triangle because they were just friends. And people are so conflicted by that because how can they be just friends with boys?
My daughter Samantha and I talk about that all the time, about the importance of platonic friendships, how underrated they are. Friendship, I don't know what I'd do without my friendships. They're so important. I feel that's just one of the things that gets my goat, is when people have to turn every relationship into something sexual. Do you really have to do that? I mean, I'm not against relationships being sexual, but there's so many different kinds of relationships out there, and they can be complex, and they can be they just fit a totally different bill than the romantic one. That's important, equally as important to me, maybe even more so sometimes.
Yes, the relationship with Alf, I believe, was once again more maternal, because Louis had these maternal feelings for him. But it's funny because I believe May was also like trying to guide him to be more productive, which is what Amy does to Laurie later on in the book.
That's so funny.
These women, they try to give nudge for these boys to better themselves.
No matter if that explains to me why Louisa was able to sit down and slam out that book as fast as she did, because so much of it had actually happened. Just, remember when Laddie? Huh, yeah, I'll put that down.
Yeah, I want to make an episode about Laddie, but I need to read more about him.
Oh, that would be an interesting one.
Yeah, maybe for the next season. We'll see. I have so many stuff that I need to do.
Yeah, hospital sketches.
Yeah, I need to read that one, and I am reading this book about Charles Follen, who was one of the real-life Friedrichs, and it's so interesting because he was this German immigrant who moved to America, and he married an American female writer, and that's such Joe and Friedrich chemistry storyline. And then there are some sequences in Charles Follen's biography that are taken to Little Woman almost word by word. So Louisa May Alcott directly copied them from Charles Vaughan's biography. So there we definitely have one Frederick Bear from real life.
Was he a teacher?
He was a teacher in university.
And he got railroaded out for political reasons?
Yes, from Germany.
I did read about him. He's actually quite fascinating.
I agree. So that will be an interesting episode when I get to make it.
Yeah. That's just important American history, in my opinion. What happens to him?
Yes.
He has to go of it.
And I really like that because Germans weren't really seen very positive light during the time when the old woman appeared. So it's interesting that there is this international marriage there. But also because Louisa May Alcott simply loved Germany, which is a very interesting area to study.
The book has such a domestic and local feel to it that I'm sometimes I'm reminded, especially this last reading, how cosmopolitan it really is. Europe is heavily involved in it, and I mean, starting with Laurie, and then Amy's own travels, and Laurie again, and Fritz. The world is in this book.
You get to travel all these places.
What attracted you to Little Women initially? What has been the main reason why you have felt so compelled to dig so deeply into Louisa and this story?
I read it as a child first, and I liked it. But then when I was a teenager, I really just fell for it. And that's when I read the sequels and Rose in Bloom and Eight Cousins. Well, everything that they had translated into Finnish at that point.
And it keeps you going. It keeps you digging.
Yeah. I think it was really when I started to read about the real life Fredrik and the real life Lauries, because I thought that was really interesting. Because I was always really frustrated when people made fun of the marriages in Little Woman, because to me they made all perfect sense. So to find out that there was a real life stories behind them, that really got me interested.
Thank you so much for inviting me to read this chapter and to discuss it with you. I feel so honored and happy to have had this time with you.
It's great to have you here. I always read your YouTube comments and I'm like, oh, I need to invite her to the podcast.
Oh my gosh, I was so surprised when I received that invitation. I was worried about so many things, technology, my brains. That's enough. I don't have to be worried about more than those two things. Thank you, Niina.
Thank you, Kymberly. So on. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening. Take care and make good choices. Bye.